One day we came across this photo of a gravestone, and that's when my dad finally told us that this is where my grandfather and great-grandfather were buried. But not in China, in Mississippi.
纪录片《Far East Deep South》主角赵保荣因为一张老照片对家族历史感到好奇，在加州出生长大的他，与父亲踏上前往密西西比州的寻根之旅，试图找出埋葬了父子俩从未谋面的祖父和曾祖父的墓地，以及家族在美中两国迁徙的故事。他惊讶地发现，这个位于美国南部的小镇，还曾有一段祖父串起的亚裔与非裔共筑友谊的故事。
Far East Deep South is a story about Baldwin's own family roots. Please give us a brief storyline of your family from Guangdong to the U.S. and how they settled down in Mississippi Delta and went up to Sacramento area. What are the different drives behind these migrations?
Yeah, thanks for having us. And it's actually kind of a two-part story, so maybe I'll let you start with the beginning.
Well, Baldwin's family is from Sunhui in Cantonese, Xinhui, China, and in the Guangdong province. And so well, we're going to have to spoil the film a little bit. So growing up, Baldwin did not know anything about his father's side of the family, but we do know his great-great-grandparents were born there. And then at some point, they came over to the United States to San Francisco, and then his great-grandfather was born in the United States. And then his great-grandfather ended up moving down to Louisiana, to New Orleans and the Baton Rouge area before going up to Mississippi. Or actually, he went to Memphis first in Tennessee, and then went to different cities in Mississippi before settling down in Pace, Mississippi, which is where he had his grocery store till the end of his life. Now, where it gets complicated is then Baldwin's grandfather, great-grandfather, he was in Mississippi, but because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, it was very difficult to find a wife here in the United States. And so he had to go back to China to actually find a wife, have a family. And eventually he was able to bring his family back to the United States. And the pattern was repeated again for Baldwin's grandfather because of the Chinese Exclusion Act and other very restrictive immigration laws. He went back to China to have a family. And that was how your father was born.
Right. And so when my father was finally born, he was also born in China. So he should have been born in the U.S., but he wasn't, like Larissa said, because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. My father eventually came over in the 50s, early 50s, 1952.
Two to be exact, yes.
And that was because, and it was difficult in that sense too, because a special bill had to be created in order to get him to come over, even though he was already legally able to come over. Once again, kind of the consequences of the Chinese Exclusion Act.
How about you, Larissa? Could you share with us your family migration curve and how it overlaps with Baldwin's?
Well, my parents have a very different story. My father's family was originally from Zhongshan, and he and my grandfather ended up doing business in Shanghai. So my father's side of the family, even though they're Cantonese, they are actually, they were born in Shanghai. My mom was also born in Shanghai. And so my grandfather is from Suzhou and my grandmother is from Ningbo. And so, in I think it was around 1949, they ended up going to Hong Kong. And from Hong Kong, they came to the United States, or at least my mom and my dad came to the United States as graduate students in the 1960s. So a little bit different in terms of the reasons why they came, but certainly they, at least your mom was from, came over from Hong Kong as well, but they definitely had a little overlap, but somewhat
but different experiences, but similar in experiences as far as how it felt like to be a first-time immigrant to the U.S.
Please summarize the storyline of Far East Deep South. For Baldwin's ancestors, how could they deal with the obvious racism, segregation, loneliness, depression, and financial burdens?
7 years ago, we took a trip to Mississippi for the first time because Baldwin didn't know anything about his father's side of the family. And all we knew was we found a picture of a gravestone.
And we knew that we had to go to Mississippi to find out where it was. That's where we eventually learned that this gravestone was. It was in Mississippi.
And that was of your grandfather and your great-grandfather.
Right. And we had no idea about that. And we're like, why were they in Mississippi? Because we told you earlier, even though we have a long lineage in this country, we did not know that until just recently. In fact, I thought most of my life I was the first one born in the United States. So these are the things that we went to Mississippi for in order to find out and learn more about. And we discovered this history that we were never taught growing up. And we found out that there was a strong and a relatively large population of Chinese in Mississippi living in the Black community, still under the same laws of segregation, Jim Crow, in addition to the Chinese Exclusion Act era. So all those things made us really kind of discover a new story behind our own American lineage and identity. And that's how we felt like we needed to make this film.
Right. And so the film follows our journey in discovery. So the film follows our journey of discovery in Mississippi and our personal family discoveries, and also the history of the Chinese in the Mississippi Delta during segregation.
And tell us about Chinese community's bridge function between whites and blacks down in Mississippi. We understand that the racial relations could be tense sometimes in that time period. Why is it important for current and future generation to know about this part of history for Chinese Americans?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it was a different era back then than today. We found that Chinese really were stuck between black and white. They really didn't know where they belonged many of the times, and I think for us to find out and learn that they were able to find ways to kind of live together, even though there were definitely a lot harsher climates as far as race goes and racism went. But for today, we feel like, because we didn't learn about that history, because we don't know about our own history, we tend to continue to see each other as foreign. We continue to see each other as not belonging in America. We tend to see different races and different groups of people as separate rather than united. And I think that's why we felt like, this story had to be told. We could definitely learn from our past to learn that we had common ground, even though they may have been harsh. And those common grounds kind of kept us together.
Well, and to kind of talk a little bit more about the racism, I think that the Chinese community experienced in the South, I think any person of color, and at that time, pretty much if you were not white, you were basically kind of outcast and you were treated as a second-class citizen. And in our research for our film and interviewing different people, we even talked to members of the Black community who had told us when the Chinese first came in the 1800s, they were actually treated even worse than the Black community. And it was only over time that they slowly gained a little bit more favor. But even then, they still were not treated as equal as the white community. Certainly they were not allowed to live in the white neighborhoods. They were not allowed to own property. They were not allowed to go to schools with the white children. And sometimes they were not even allowed to go to the school with Black children. They had to have their own separate mission school. We heard from many of the Chinese who grew up in the Mississippi Delta. There was discrimination in terms of being turned away for medical services. One man we talked to said their family couldn't even get a haircut at an establishment because
go swimming
because they were refused service. And the reality is, one thing we showed in our film is even cemeteries. You could not even be buried in a cemetery with anyone else besides your own race, and so they had to actually establish a separate cemetery for the Chinese. So the racism definitely ran deep, the segregation ran deep, and so a lot of the Chinese felt isolation, I think, on an individual basis, but as a community, they would gather together and they would have these banquets and they would have parties just to have that community because they were kind of shut out from the rest of society.
And that's really how they were able to make it, is really they had to depend on each other. They had to grow together and realize that they had to, in order to do things, they couldn't do them separately.
Yeah, and I think furthermore about the racial relationship between the Black and the Chinese community, I think the thing that was very eye-opening for us is that, I grew up in Los Angeles, and even current day, I mean, we know the more recent history in the larger cities, there's been a lot more tension between the Black and the Asian communities. And for us to discover back in the 1900s, even going back to the 1800s, early times, there was a time when there was a very respectful and a very symbiotic, very connected relationship between the Black and the Chinese community. One of the things that was fascinating was to discover that the Black customers, neighbors, much preferred to shop and go to a Chinese grocery store, because if they went to a white grocery store, they would have to use a separate entrance, and they were treated terribly, where they felt very respected, treated much better by the Chinese. And the Chinese, especially during the Great Depression, the Chinese grocery store owners actually extended credit to the members of the Black community there, and without any interest. And there was a very trusting relationship between the two communities that I think we can learn from today.
Mm-hmm. What's the impact of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act on your ancestors? And at that time, what kind of visa status did they have?
Yeah, so I mean, that's an interesting question, because most of my life, I didn't think anything of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Actually, I didn't even know anything about it. And all I knew is that I had no grandparents. I had no grandfather. And what we realized was that it was directly because of the Chinese Exclusion Act that I did not know my grandfather. That it was because of the Chinese Exclusion Act that my father never had a father to grow up with. It was the Chinese Exclusion Act that separated our family that was here in the U.S. 100 years ago, over 100 years ago. And that's what separated them from my father. And that's why it was so hard, even for multiple generations, to even be born here in the U.S. And it really took almost 100 years before I was able to be born here in the U.S. again, after my great-grandfather was initially born here. So before the 1882 Exclusion Act, there wasn't really visas. It was kind of like an open system. People, before Asians came to America, Americans went to Asia to get Asians to bring them over. It was like, they needed Asians and Chinese for here, to be laborers, and other people too, other minority groups. They all brought them here to build this country. So it really wasn't until the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act that these immigration policies set, and those policies were the ones that separated my family from my Chinese family in China from my American family here for multiple generations.
Well, and it gets complicated, because the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was just one of many other subsequent immigration laws that were passed that prevented a lot of different people groups, even beyond Chinese, from coming to the United States and also attaining citizenship. And that was, the biggest thing. And what we discovered is the fact that Baldwin's great-great-grandparents came before the 1882 Exclusion Act at some point. And then his great-grandfather, we discovered through our research, was born in the United States. And by derivative birthright citizenship, his grandfather was able to come to the United States. Where it gets complicated is his father should have been entitled to that same citizenship, but because of his grandfather passing early and because of the restrictive immigration laws, a special bill had to be passed by a senator and by Congress to allow his father to come in 1952. Because even after the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943, there was still a quota of only 105 Chinese that were allowed in the country, unless you fell into an exemption of being a scholar or a diplomat or a merchant, which his father was not any of those. So he ended up coming in under a special bill.
As the second or fourth generation Chinese American, please tell us how you see the current racial relations in America. Are Chinese Americans enjoying what American society offers as well as other races? And what are good and what may need to improve?
I think that's the complexity of being American. And I think most of us as Chinese and Asians, we want to be proud of being an American. And I think I am very proud to be American. I'm very proud to be Chinese, and this environment is harsh right now. And I think there are definitely tensions between ethnic groups, and people can't tell the difference between a Chinese American of 5-6 generations or any Asian person of 5-6 generations here in America from maybe what the Chinese government is. But I think we are proud to be American, not because the past has been perfect or been good to us. I think I'm proud to be American because we in America have an opportunity to make things better. We can stand up, we can have a voice, we can have dialogues like this, we can create change, we can run for office, we can point out the things in America that has been flawed, is continued to be flawed right now, and we can actually do something about it. And I think that's the beauty of being an American, is having those opportunities to do that.
Well, and I think if you look at our community over the generations, take Baldwin's family for instance, they came in as poor laborers. And, eventually after several generations, they became merchants. And then after several generations, they were able to attain, Baldwin's the first person in his family to go to university, graduate from a four-year university. And so there has been progress made. And a lot of the people from the Mississippi Delta, were the first ones in their family to attend college. And you see that now where there is certainly a large proportion of Asians in the higher education system in America, because education is very important to our culture. However, you look at other sectors and we have not quite attained the same status or succeeded. Entertainment, where we work, for one, there's still a lot of missing stories and an exclusion and a lot of stereotypes that are still being perpetuated and in the media. You look at even in our government and leadership in this country, we haven't had the same type of influence in the political realm. We don't have an Asian American president yet. We have a lot of ways to go in terms of, being in the upper echelons of, I think, of leadership or even influences. I mean, in education, we were great students, but our histories are not in the books. I mean, that's one thing we're very passionate. When you ask Americans today, like, name a prominent, Asian American historical figure, that isn't recent, very few people can even name one. Somebody will name like Bruce Lee, who is just a martial artist, but
very good martial artist.
A very good martial artist
from 50 years ago.
But there are so many people that are of even just Chinese descent. You think about Wong Kim Ark, who helped uphold the 14th Amendment's birthright citizenship. He took a case to the Supreme Court. Nobody knows who he is. There are so many other people, Dr. Mabel Lee, who was part of the women's suffrage movement, that people do not know about. And yet, our daughter goes to a Mandarin immersion school, and her teachers, who mostly are Chinese, mm-hmm. and many of them from mainland China, they can tell you more about the white historical figures and the Black historical figures and even the Hispanic historical figures than they can about Asian historical figures in America. So that we have a long ways to go in terms of where we are in enjoying some of the statuses and respect and feeling of belonging in America.
I actually don't know where we are going and where we're going.
Last thing I thought I'd ever find in Mississippi was a Chinese museum.
I guess there was more than just my grandfather and my great-grandfather.
When the Chinese first came to the Delta, they were treated like we were.
Everything was very segregated. I mean, it was black, white. We were just really in the middle.
I had to attend a segregated one-room schoolhouse.
Growing up, I read about segregation, and I thought that it only affected the Black community.
I just didn't really think that it happened to the Chinese too.
What?
Great-grandpa.